Hello, my name is Kevin Ostoyich. I'm a professor of history at Valparaiso University. I will be moderating this panel discussion about the film Harbor from the Holocaust. Today we have with us Doris Fogel, who is a Holocaust survivor and Shanghailander. We have Andy Kang, who is an executive director of the Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Chicago, and Danny Spungen, a trustee of the Florence and Laurence Spungen Family Foundation. First, I'd like to talk about the history of Shanghai. Andy, Danny, Doris, could you tell us about the specific themes from the film that resonate with you?
Well, for me, having been there for 8 years, I would say what I have seen of the film so far depicts somehow where we were living, how we were living, the streets of Shanghai in this poorest section of Shanghai.
And from my perspective, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Doris.
No, that's one little thing. Go ahead.
In my perspective, I mean, the documentary, it's amazing how they put so much into basically a 10-year period, 1939 to 49, basically. They put a lot in there and they did a very good job. I think Doris had a very good comment in the documentary, trying to do normal things in unnormal times to survive. I think that's a very interesting phrase and tagline that could be used throughout this whole discussion.
Especially now with everybody pushing for kids to go back to school. And I have to say, when we talk about the film itself, one of the things that is not highlighted at all are the 2 Jewish schools that were established for us, the Kaduri School and I believe it was called Shanghai Jewish School or something. I went to the Kaduri School, SJYA. And because Mr. Kaduri is very important in this whole 8-year period.
Andy, I'm wondering, when you watch this film, what specific themes resonate with you?
Yeah, I think this was a story that I actually did not know a ton about. So it was incredibly eye-opening for me to hear this story. But, I was born and raised in the Chicagoland. My parents hail from South Korea. And my father was of an age that he remembers Japanese occupation of Korea, which went on for, several decades. In fact, he grew up going to grade school where the school teachers were Japanese and had Japanese samurai swords in the classroom. He was prevented from speaking Korean and had to go separately to Korean grade school at night in secret. And so, my familiarity with World War II and Asia is primarily around the brutality of Imperial Japan towards the Chinese, towards the Koreans, towards the Filipinos. And so this was a fascinating story. When I think of the Holocaust, I always think of Europe. And I never realized, one of the themes that I think I'd like to come back to is just how even in a time of war and chaos and so much evil being committed, that certain individuals or small groups of individuals, because of whatever circumstance led to them having some level of privilege, right? Not a ton more, but a little bit more opportunity or power or authority, exercising that for the benefit of others and taking that risk and leading to such significant ripple effects as far as the impact on thousands of people. And I think we always, tend to think of, when there's so much going on, what can I as just one person do? And I think this is a perfect example of these moments of courage where people risked a little something for somebody else and that leading to tremendous life-saving consequences.
Doris, I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the film, the depiction of this history in the film, given that this is a history that you were a part of.
Well, run that by me again, exactly what you want to know.
I'm wondering what your thoughts about how this film depicts the history, given this is the history that you're a part of.
Well, I know I'm a part of it. I speak about it all the time. I don't feel that enough in the film is depicting of how some of us live, how others lived that were more privileged. There were even two, as far as I can tell, two different Jewish communities. You had people like myself, my mother, a widow, living with, there were 5 of us in one small room. Then I had someone who is Orthodox tell me, oh, wonderful Friday night dinner. Well, where did that come from? They had the yeshiva. They got money. We had nothing. As I say, there were 5 of us. My mother and I, my aunt, uncle, and cousin. He's 5 years older than I am. He's 91 now. And if we had a piece of chicken, we made it last all week. And, there are dichotomies. There's so many different things and people that were there, and how some people somehow came with money or made themselves richer. My mother was a widow. She worked in the soup kitchen there because she had a child to support. So there are just, and I have to say, I still have fond memories because of the school. The Kaduri school gave us so much. And, I tell the students, when you have to think about this, we had no school books. Our parents made books for us, okay? And we had teachers that came from Europe that were teachers. We had to learn how to speak English. We spoke British English. That's fine. I worked hard to lose that because I never wanted anybody to ask me, where are you from, Doris? When I came to America. And yet, when I say we lived a normal life under unnormal circumstances, we went to school, we had plays, I was an athlete, and somehow these things happen. And when I came to America at the age of 13, my mother took me to the Board of Education to have me tested. Under the circumstances that we lived in without books, when I was tested, they said I could be a sophomore in high school. And my mother, who was a German educated woman who spoke English, looked at them and said, where does a 13-year-old belong? 13-year-old belongs in 8th grade. That's where I started my education. I mean, I could go on, but you have other things that you would like to know.
Well, I have a question for Danny. I'm wondering if there's anything about the film that you found surprising when you watched it.
Actually, the fact that I found no surprises is actually pretty impressive. The fact is I know at least 30 plus Shanghai, we call them Shanghailanders. And they all had such amazingly different stories. So the fact that this documentary had no surprises was very good. The fact is this story could have legs. I mean, there's many, many twists and turns that took place in Shanghai and in the stories that we hear today that people talk about Shanghai, even amongst the Chinese. So the story can have legs. And I thought this documentary really tried to keep it in check. So no surprises.
Andy, I'm wondering if you found any surprises, anything that struck you as just completely new for you.
Yeah, and aside from the overall story, I think I was not aware that there was such a sizable Jewish community already in Shanghai, hearing about the Baghdadi Jewish community that was already there, but also
Oh, sure.
not just being there, but being incredibly wealthy, having, I think the documentary references being involved with the opium trade, which of course was something that the British imposed on China via a war. And so, there's these strange moments where you see, whether it's the colonial presence of the different European countries in America, creating an opportunity, right, in Shanghai. These things that are not great in the neutral, and just looking them on their face, become opportunities, little loopholes, if you will, in a crisis for folks to survive, really. And so I think that was surprising to hear. Not only was there a Jewish community that was thriving and doing quite well there, but was a critical piece to the refugees coming from Europe and having a chance, right? And we know that turns a little bit on the Baghdadi Jewish community post Pearl Harbor, but it's fascinating to learn about all of that.
Doris, I'm wondering,
Yes.
when you watch other Shanghailanders, such as in this film, talk about their experience, what are you thinking? And are you ever surprised by the stories that you hear?
Well, some of the stories that I hear, yes, I am surprised. I think back, of my own growing up there, and I have learned a lot from other Shanghailanders. It was, I would say, 50 years when I had gone to some reunions, but it was 50 years later that at a reunion of Shanghailanders that I did not attend because of circumstances, but my name was on the list, approximately 12 of us classmates reunited after not having any contact or seeing each other for 50 years. And the first time we met, I remember the whole evening was, do you remember? And there were different remembrances of, and we, for about 15 years, met in a different country or a different city in the United States, having reunions. And we would always come up with new things. And also, Kevin, I grew up in a generation where, unfortunately, our parents did not talk to us and tell us things the way I have done with my own children and even grandchildren. And I always say, to this day, I regret that I did not did not sit down with my mother and record her, intelligent woman, and whereas my children and grandchildren grew up knowing their mother was a Holocaust survivor. And, which brings me to something else. I mean, Danny has heard me speak at the museum. And when I speak, I start out, and you see this in the film, one of the last few scenes that you see, before I even talk about myself and why are we here, I say to the students, or even if it's an adult group, do you know who is a Holocaust survivor? Holocaust survivor does not necessarily have to have a number on their arm or have been in a concentration camp. However, anybody that had to leave their homeland because of the coming war is a Holocaust survivor. After all, America had closed their doors. We all know about the St. Louis. I had 2 aunts and uncles that died on that ship that never made it out. So, there are so many stories to tell about this. And I think one of the most perplexing things to me is the fact that 9 out of 10 people, I would say even more than that, that you meet had no idea and still have no idea that 20,000 Jews were interned in Shanghai and went through hell and back. However, again, I tell the students, I weighed 65 pounds when I came to America. And my mother and I went through hell, but it was a walk in the park compared to my relatives and all the other people that died.
Doris, you say that you wish you would have recorded your mother,
Yes,
but in this documentary, your story has been recorded.
right.
And which of course speaks to the importance of documentaries like this.
Right.
I'm wondering, what was it like for you to be recorded for this documentary? Tell us a little bit about the process by which you were recorded and what
I can tell.
that was
All
like
right.
for you.
I can tell you honestly, the woman that did this, her name is Violet Feng. She is from Shanghai originally. She lives in New York. And even the first evening when I got to New York and we sat down, and Iris Sampson, who's a woman from PBS in Pittsburgh, we sat down and we talked. And then the next day, I spent 3 hours at it's called the Joint Distribution Committee, who was very important in helping us survive, especially at the end of the war. Kevin, she asked questions and brought things out in me that I haven't talked about in years and years and years. I found myself crying. You know, when I talk to students, it isn't so much about me, it's how did this happen? How can we keep this from happening again? And even though, and I'm being very honest with you, even though I never try to add politics or religion when I speak, but I do say sometimes, if the man who's sitting in the White House now would have been in the White House in 1939 or in 1947, I wouldn't be here. So, you know, Violet did such an outstanding job in interviewing me for 2-3 hours. As I say, I talked about things I hadn't talked about in years and years or brought out. You know, one of the things that I said to my mother when we landed in San Francisco, Mom, you're in America now. You speak English on the street. You want to speak German, which I still speak fluently, we speak it at home. That was very important to me. And that still is important to me. You know, don't lose track of who you are. I spoke 4 languages when I came to America. And the one language that I wanted to lose more than any was German. Guess what? I'm still fluent in German, but I don't speak Chinese or French anymore. So there were just a multitude of stories to tell. And she brought a lot out in me that I hadn't talked about before.
Well, Doris, your words remind us the importance of preserving these
Right.
stories and preserving this history. And Danny, I know that you have been very active in trying to preserve this history. Could you tell us what are the efforts right now that are going on to preserve this history, and what are the challenges to preserving this history?
Well, there's a lot going on in Shanghai itself, in the old Jewish, we call it the ghetto. It was actually a designated area for stateless refugees, but it's commonly known as the Shanghai ghetto, where the Jews were, Hankyu, where the Jews were forced to live, most of them, after February 1943. That area has mostly been destroyed for modernization. It's nothing unusual, but there was a big campaign in the last few years. Unfortunately, they took about 70 families behind the museum, which was the old synagogue, and they moved them out and they expanded the museum in a very, very big way. So there is a lot of expansion to, quote, preserve this story. We could probably get into it later. I don't know if you want to hit it now or later, but there's a lot going on in Shanghai and within America, because I think there was one question I was going to bring up is, is there something that the documentary did not cover that maybe should have been aware of? And it covers your question, Kevin. And one thing that was overlooked a little bit is that we talk about the approximately 18,000 Jewish refugees. Back in this time during World War II, the definition of a Jew was defined by Hitler as, basically speaking, anyone that had a grandparent. If you're 25% Jewish, you are fully Jewish. Well, the Shanghai ghetto, Shanghai had many, a small number, but still many by numbers, of Christian mixed marriages. So we have Gary in Las Vegas now. We have Ellie, who lives in Palm Springs, California. And just last month, I went to the funeral of Carla from Illinois. She was buried by a Baptist minister. But in 2013, she came out and said, you know what, I really am Jewish. My father was Jewish in Europe. My mother was a widow and took my brother and I to Shanghai. And her mother was not Jewish. She was Catholic at the time. But there were organizations just for non-Jewish people living in Shanghai. That's one thing that the documentary did not cover that I think is good to notice. And also
Mishlings. They were called Mishlings.
Correct. And there were a number of them. I know 3 of them right now. And I think that part, so there's a lot of history that needs to be uncovered still today, and we're still doing it. We're still doing it, and we have a lot of documents to show this different lifestyle.
One
Kevin,
thing that, I'm sorry.
Excuse me, I need to interject here because when you asked me about the filming.
Yes.
There important things that I thought were important. For instance, one of the survivors whom I've known for 75 years and been friends with, he's in the documentary. His name is Klaus Hirsch. We met in New York when I was there for the filming, and they made it look at a river, and they made it look like, had me running to him, like this is the first time I've seen him in all these years. Okay, they did not put that into the film, which is something important. And yet they filmed me at 9/11 walking around the pond, touching the names. One does not really relate to the other. And it is more important to show the connection of people. I mean, that, at least in my estimation, that is important.
You mentioned names, and one thing that is being actively done is the preservation of the names, and we see that in the film, very strong depiction of the wall of names.
The wall.
Yes, and I'm wondering, Danny, if you could tell us. I know that you're part of the history of the wall of names. Could you tell us about why and how that wall of names came about?
Wow, that's a good question. There is in the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum in Shanghai, in about 2014 or 15, they put up a wall of about 14,000 plus names on a wall of, they try to get all 18,000, but they've got up to over 14,000 names. Why did they do that? I think part of it, you'd have to ask the museum directly, but in my opinion, having names and not numbers is something that's commonly done in the United States and in Europe with education. Right. They try to focus on names, not numbers. That's actually the name of a program in Chicagoland area, and I'm sure around the world. So I think that's one area. I think the museum wanted to have a memorial wall, just like you see at 9/11 that Doris mentioned, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in DC. There's Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Israel, the US Holocaust Museum. We want to focus a lot on names. I suspect and I hope that's one reason why they did it. And I should note that the German government, they funded most of that wall. Our foundation, we were the second donor, but a much, much smaller amount. But the Israel consulate and the United States government, no one else contributed money, just the German government, which I was very proud to say.
And I can tell you, I have pictures of my name and my mother's name on that wall.
What does it mean to you to have have your name on that wall?
Well, thank goodness for me, I'm still alive. But who knows, at 86, you know, I feel like my kids will kill me if I say this, especially my grandchildren, but my days are numbered, you know, and even though, knock wood, I'm very healthy, who knows? But it's important for future generations that go there. Us Jewish people are used to playing Jewish geography. Danny knows that. I just identified him as being a fraternity brother of my son. They were in college together. And so it's important for us not to be forgotten. You know, a little side story that I tell, you know, I've spoken around the country, and many years ago, I spoke to a group, a club, 65 international harvester men, retired men, all of whom served in either the Army, the Navy, you name it, not in World War II. Not one of them knew that 20,000 Jews were interned in Shanghai. So, you know, it's important to bring this forth because it wasn't pleasant most of the time. The people that had some money or that made the best of the situation, that's one thing. But then there were us. And, you know, kids are wonderful. I use this, a bit of my story, as a learning tool. Why did this happen? How do we keep this from happening again? You know, be an upstander and fight for what's right and for what's good. So there are so many lessons to be learned from this.
I should point out, when Danny was talking about the museum, and when we talk about the Wall of Names, that we're referring to the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum, which is in Shanghai, China. And they are very much in the forefront in terms of commemorating the history of the Shanghai Jews. I'd like to hear from all three panelists what your idea of commemorating history means. And is it important for us to be commemorating history? Andy, you were nodding. If you could start us off, what do you think commemorating history means?
Yeah, you know, I know our country right now is having a very deep, sometimes challenging conversation about our history, right? And I think one of the takeaways from that, and it kind of connects to having watched this film, is how important it is to acknowledge the true story, right? Not the don't want to be derogatory towards greeting cards, but not the Hallmark version
You're right.
of the story, right? Not the cleaned up version with the happy ending always, right? But the story with tragedy, the story with sacrifice, the story with folks surviving and you know, coming out through a horrific ordeal, right? And I think we're getting better at that. I think this is one of those stories that Doris, I do want to recognize. People, the antiseptic version of this might be that folks from Europe went to China, had a great time, were super safe, and then came to America, right? Where what I'm hearing from you is this was an incredibly, you know, certainly while it may not have been, it was an incredibly challenging, incredibly dire situation, even in China, right?
Exactly.
So I think we need to learn from these stories, and I think commemorating is absolutely appropriate, whether it's this story, where it's our nation's connection to slavery and the oppression that happened afterwards.
Exactly.
Whatever those stories are, that we own them, and then we take those lessons that are really important so that we can become that better society that we all hope
you know, I'm interjecting here again. I mean, it's hard to stop me from talking. I love to talk, but children are wonderful. And the questions that I have gotten, some have really gone to my heart. Yom HaShoah, which is the Day of Remembrance, I have done many services all over the country. And 2 years ago, I did one in Flint, Michigan. And the next day, they booked me in 3 schools. The last one was a high school. And after I got through towards the end with question and answer, a little boy asked me, do you have any, family members left? And I said, no, my whole family was killed, my family now. And it was, my mother and I were the only survivors. Afterwards, like many of the kids do all the time, they came up, some girls and some boys, to give me a hug, have a picture taken. And that little boy was standing next to me. He was a sophomore in high school. And he said, Doris, I just want you to know that we now are your family. You know, you hear stories like that, and then light bulbs go up in your eyes. One of the last things that I say when I talk to the kids about my story before I go into learning, I say, you know, the day we left Shanghai, I thought my bed would walk out by itself because it was so infested with bed bugs. Would the day ever come that I would have my own bed, not one that I had to share with my mother? Okay? All my life, I sleep on the left side of my bed. The right side, never touched. And you know what? A bell went up, a light bulb went up in my head. Now I know why I sleep that way, because I never had any room to sleep any other way. So, you know, there are just so many things that come up when we're questioned, and there's so many things that people need to know. And today in the paper, another Holocaust survivor died. Every day. And out of our group of 15 that reunited, I believe there are 4 of us left. And one in Sao Paulo, a good friend in Sao Paulo, Brazil, died of the virus, COVID-19. So, you know, I feel so lucky that I'm alive, that I'm able to talk, and all the volunteer work that I have done over the years is my thanks to the Joint, to the Highest. They talk about Laura Margolis in the movie. That's why I've done what I've done.
Danny, you have been on the front lines with respect to trying to preserve this history, in particular with material objects and documents, and making sure that families do not throw out the items. But you are also very much into the issue of commemorating this history, and you're very knowledgeable about how this history is being commemorated today. Could you tell us a little bit about how this history is being commemorated and whether or not there are any controversies about how this is being commemorated?
Nothing's perfect in preservation in history. And those who tell the history are those that are in control at that moment. So there is a lot of controversy and concerns about the museum in Shanghai. But for me, I think you have to pick and choose your battles. I think the world community should be grateful that China has allowed this museum to grow and thrive, and to teach the 1.3 or 4 billion Chinese the story of the Jewish people and what they endured during history, and including World War II in Shanghai. It's like the Illinois Holocaust Museum, their tagline is remembering the past, yet don't forget the past, but transform the future. So I do think the museum in China is somewhat political, of course, because the Chinese, they sometimes want to stretch the phrase that China saved the Jews, you know, and some Shanghailanders say from their heart, oh, thank God for China. Thank you, Shanghai. Well, the fact is Shanghai was just the Wild West of World War II. There was no China after 1937. It was occupied by the Japanese. Shanghai was an open port. So here comes all this influx of the Jewish refugees, mostly Jewish refugees. And so now, after 1949, all the Christian cemeteries, all the Jewish cemeteries were destroyed just for modernization, for communism. And now that 1 square mile approximately of what we call the Shanghai ghetto is mostly gone. So I think we should be honored that there's an effort in China where Judaism is not, quote, recognized to grow and thrive. In saying that, there's a bunch of volunteers, including you and I, Kevin. We call it the Volunteer Advisory Council. We're trying to make sure the storyline stays within context as much as we can. The Chinese, they're not going to give the Japanese any credit for saving the Jews, or not enough credit. And there's also a question about numbers. We talked about the wall, and Doris refers to 20,000. There were approximately 18 to 20,000 refugees, Jewish-related refugees in Shanghai. But for many years, the Chinese were saying 30,000. And it was in the text. And finally, they changed it to approximately 20,000. But now there's a push again by some scholars in China to say, well, no, we have new information, at least 30,000 Jewish refugees. And they have clips of people where they would say, have the Shanghailanders, the refugees and survivors like Doris, saying, oh, thank you, Shanghai. Thank you, Chinese people. So it's true, they should be thinking they're Chinese neighbors. They were there suffering together. But there was no invitation to come to Shanghai by China. It just happened. So we're trying to control the storyline a little bit, as much as we can. But anything is better than nothing, I think.
You better believe it.
One of the things that comes up quite often in the interviews that I conduct interviews of Shanghailanders all over the world. And one common theme is that Shanghailanders will say that for most of their lives, people were not very interested or didn't ask them much about their Shanghai past. And they didn't actually talk about their Shanghai past very often. But it's been much more recent in, say, the last decade, and increasingly so over the last few years, that this story has become very interesting to a wide number of people. And Shanghailanders have been asked more and more to talk about their history and asked to document their history. I'm wondering, Doris, does that sound familiar to you? Is that your experience, that for most of your life, people did not express the same amount of interest in your Shanghai past?
Well, exactly. But what's happened is that people that have accumulated money and that are able to travel, more and more people have traveled to Shanghai in the last few years. When I say few, say the last 10 or 20 years. And when they get there and they see this museum, and I understand there's a wonderful Jewish guide there from Israel, and they learn about what happened, and they come home and they talk to their friends, and it gets spread by word of mouth more and more. And I think that's why in the last 10, 20 years, more and more people want to know about that part of World War II, which really was never talked about. It was insignificant. You know, it was very important to those of us that were able to, we left in January of '39. You realize that was by the skin of our teeth that we were able to get passage to go to Shanghai, and we'll be forever grateful that that happened, you know. And so I think that has a lot to do with it. And also college educated kids, more and more kids that are intelligent and that are learning about history want to know about that part of history. You know, World War II has been written about in 1,000 different ways. And many people are tired of reading some of the stories that have come out, some true, some exaggerated, whatever. But all of a sudden, here is a part of World War II that really had not been talked about or people know about, and it has become, I don't know, do I dare use the word fashionable to talk about it? I think that has a lot to do with it.
I'm wondering, Andy and Danny, if you have any thoughts on this issue of why this history is now becoming much more popular, and there's more of an interest in it now?
Well, I wouldn't know for sure, but I think one of the things, at least here in the United States, that we're seeing, obviously, there's been a lot of activity around refugee policy. We are now, at least for the last decade, as far as I know, at the lowest levels of accepting refugees from around the world. At a time when we know there are absolutely places that refugees are looking for safety, right? Whether it's Central America and Latin America, whether it's here in Chicago on the north side. I think many folks know that one of our neighbors was for many years has been Refugee One, who helps resettle refugees from not only Africa but from Myanmar, from Asia, from all different parts of the world. And I think there is a hunger to understand like how these decisions that are made. In this instance, these were, as Danny mentioned, kind of a chaotic limbo area where Shanghai didn't have a fully functioning government. But when we make certain decisions about approving someone to be welcome in a place, how much of a game changer that can be, not just for that individual or his or her family, but for entire people. And so I think people are hungering for those stories so that we know that when we make these decisions now and going forward, we understand that while we may not right away see the benefit, there is a higher likelihood of confidence that these are absolutely going to make huge differences in the lives of others. And I would argue benefit all of us by having them join our society, right? So that's one of the bigger things that I think I took away from this.
Danny?
Yeah, so Kevin, I think I'm interested in Doris's perspective. When Doris gets up on stage at the museum and talks about what is a Holocaust survivor, that's a very important comment for Doris to make, because one reason why our foundation became somewhat known for this niche of the Shanghai story is that we want to bring out our foundation, our exhibit, that the Holocaust was not just something that happened in Europe. It's something of a breakdown of humanity on the worldwide scale. But when I got involved in the Shanghai story, the Shanghailanders were still known as refugees. Doris she's young, but her parents and her parents' generation, they had something of what you might call survivor's guilt. We've had many people tell us that we were just refugees. Like Doris said, it was a walk in the park compared to what happened to our brothers and sisters and families and relatives in Europe. So the refugees of Shanghai, they didn't really talk about it, and it was not that important. But in fact, the definition of a Holocaust survivor is anybody that has been displaced. And now people like Doris are very comfortable in saying we were Holocaust survivors, and they are. So, but until, let's say 2000, late 1990s, or when you can break off the time period you want, they were known as refugees and not Holocaust survivors, but they lost family. So I think that now the story is more and more popular, and I think we're spending a lot of time on there saying that the Holocaust was a breakdown of humanity on a worldwide scale. And these refugees were Holocaust survivors. And it's a very interesting story about how approximately 18,000 found refuge in Shanghai, of all places. So I think that it's very important. I should probably note, if I can, is it okay to go on one more point?
Go ahead.
The documentary, which did a great job, and listen, how they did this in such a short time is amazing. But there were about 18,000 refugees. They all shared the same experience, and Doris alluded to it, the same filth, the same lice, the same walking beds, the same overcrowded conditions. But when we got involved, and Kevin, you got involved, is when we were dealing with people that were young like Doris, and they were more resilient. They found school as a way to escape, where Doris's parents and their generations, like her parents, were amazing. They had to deal with such emotional stresses. So although they shared the same experiences physically, emotionally, it was completely different. And we have to honor the fact that people like Doris had friends that were Chinese, people like Gary Matzdorf and Carla Schock had friends. But Doris's parents, her mother, and Gary's parents they must survive. They had no time to, quote, make friendships. So everybody had a different twist on what took place in Shanghai.
That's right.
Andy, you are the executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And I'm wondering, so you're dealing with issues of today, and I'm wondering, when you watch this film, do you see this film resonate with the work that you do today?
Yeah, unfortunately, very much so. I wish I could say no, not at all. But, you know, this, I kind of had an Indiana Jones moment, right? Let's remember who the bad guys are here. And I think in America right now, unfortunately, what we're seeing, you know, is the rise of white nationalism, right? It's become
That's right.
A legitimized political movement in many ways, largely rooted in a lot of racial policies, right? Whether it's immigration, for example, is a big one, or others. And so, you know, this just gets back to Danny's point about the root of all this, right? Is a very inhumane, evil idea, right? That we're going to target a group of people and place blame on them for the majority, the biggest ills of society, right? And whenever you allow that politically to happen, it always leads to really, really dangerous, harmful things, right? And so, you know, I think it's election season. Our organization is nonpartisan, although we are progressive. I'm going to sidestep that issue. I think aside from immigration policy, the micro things that we as neighbors, as you know, members of a community can do to push back against that sentiment, right? That hateful sentiment are things that I do think locally we can move on, and it doesn't matter who's in the White House or who's controlling federal policy or what people in the white nationalist movement do. We can answer it with a loving response, and so that's what my organization is focusing on. And we are. I'm happy to announce that we just hired our anti-hate training coordinator. We'll be bringing what are called bystander intervention trainings very soon this year, and we're hoping to partner with local communities so that when you see that hate, when you see someone getting targeted or verbally harassed, you have some tools at your disposal that don't require you to be Superman, right? And have to physically put yourself in danger or intervene, but just little things you can do to support that, whoever it is being targeted, maybe de-escalate the situation. And we think if we're able to equip enough people to do that, then we'll all be better neighbors and we'll have a better community as a result.
You are so right. And you are so lucky that I've kept my mouth shut, because there are so many things I could say that I won't say because I know too many of the people that are going to be watching this next week. So I have to be very careful.
Okay, well, Doris, I do want to give you a chance, since in the film, you very self-consciously talk about today, that you do not see your past as only living in the past, and that there are specific issues today that relate directly to the experience that you had. Could you, you can be as careful as you want to be, but could you talk about what themes do you think resonate today from this film in your experience?
Well, number one, think of the hunger we went through. I weighed 65 pounds when I stepped off the boat in San Francisco at age 13. Now, think of the children here that are going hungry now, that should be fed and things should be done. Look at the people that are going to be evicted from their homes. Do they have anybody to help them? We got a lot of help. When we came to America, how did I even get to America? Because back in the 40s, well-to-do Jewish people sponsored us to come to America. Otherwise, I couldn't have come to America. We had no family left. It was just my mother and I. Now I'm very lucky. I have 3 children. I have 8 grandchildren. So that is my family. But there are so many things that we could tie into what happened to us and what is happening now that should be stopped and hopefully will be come 2021. I'm trying to be as politically correct as I can be without getting myself in trouble. So, but that to me right now it's horrifying. The stories that I read, the pictures that I see of people not having enough to eat, it's horrifying, Kevin. And but there were people in Shanghai that stepped forward. And again, it was the Jewish community from America that helped us. Laura Margolis, the Joint Distribution Committee, HIAS. If it weren't for those people, and where are those kinds of people now that should be helping the underprivileged? It's kind of horrifying. I'm at the end of my life, hopefully not real soon, but I've experienced hunger. I have experienced, when my children were growing up, they never once wore a hand-me-down because that's all I had. Now my grandchildren, they love exchanging their clothes with their cousins and all that. It's a different way to look at it. But we don't have time for me to go into what I would really like to say, and I'm not allowed to.
The 3 of you are all very active in 2020, whether it be educating in schools like Doris, or I know Danny, in addition to being on the front lines of preserving and commemorating this history, I know that you're also a docent at the Illinois Holocaust Museum, actively telling this story of the Holocaust to young people. I'm wondering if we take the film that we're all watching, Harbor from the Holocaust, which I think we all agree does a very good job in covering a lot of ground in a short amount of time. I'm wondering, do the 3 of you see yourselves using this film in the work that you do today in some way? And if so, could you explain, how do you see yourself using this film?
It's not going to be easy in some respects. Let me tell you one quick little anecdote to that, and then let the others talk. The crew from PBS, I think it was, I don't know, from out east or here, came to the museum to photograph one of my presentations to students. Now, if you speak to students, something like that, and there's going to be photographs, parents have to sign a slip giving their okay. There were at least 25 students that had to be put in a corner so that they would not appear in a photograph. And I'm looking around at the 200 students that are sitting there, and I realize that these students came from a school that is 99% Hispanic, which gave me the understanding why these children's parents would not let them get photographed, because they could be identified, and God forbid ISIS could come and take the parents out. This should not happen in the year 2020. And it was very disturbing to me to see that happen.
Danny or Andy?
Well, I'll take a quick stab at this, because I think it is challenging, but sadly, I think depending on the outcome that Doris alluded to in the elections, one scenario, I sadly think I would be using this film a lot more as an example of showing people that there's a lot you still can do, right? Even when it seems
Right.
very dark and hopeless.
Right.
But But I would say, you know, whether it was Mr. Fang's choice as a diplomat, as a bureaucrat, to make that momentous decision, right, to issue those visas, or the Americans who helped set up the school and the hospital, right, and being from a place of safety, being able to do that, right, and the impact that Doris has shared for everybody that benefited from that. I think it's important for us to stress to people, don't just think of those moments where you can leverage your privilege to benefit others in really tremendous ways. Don't just think of those when we hit dark times or when we're facing a crisis. Think about, you know, challenge yourself to think about that, flexing that muscle, even when things are seemingly good, right? Because while they may be going good for you and the news may be portraying things are back to quote unquote normal, as Doris has pointed out, they're likely not normal, nor maybe has never been normal for at least a subset of our community, right? And so if we're able to get in that mindset and keep it, just think about how much more we can do, right, to help each other.
Very good.
Danny?
I think, ironically, this documentary came out at a very good time for us, our foundation, and our work with you, Kevin, is that there's so much to absorb in World War II history, so much. And the time spent on history in the schools, I think, is sadly decreasing. So what I like about this documentary is that it allows us to pick out a little niche, a little small piece of history. We happen to have a lot of artifacts related to the Shanghai ghetto, and have a class just on the Shanghai story, showing the documentary. It's a quick 21-minute documentary. Then they see the artifacts related to it, and then they can have a discussion. So I think it allows us to have a lot of smaller discussions about why this happened, instead of trying to throw the whole bucket of World War II and the Holocaust in the faces over a small time. So what we've done is we've created little pockets, little niche classes, which include the Shanghai ghetto, the righteous among nations. Manly Ho, who's in the documentary, her father is a righteous among nations who issued the visas. So I don't have one of the visas yet, but I will get one. But then the kids can hold that visa. But I have a whole table, a whole exhibit just on the righteous. Documents issued by Ron Wallenberg, Sugihara, Polish farmers who saved Jews. I have their medals from Yad Vashem. We have a table just on Operation Bernhard, the counterfeiting of English money. We have a table just on the Łódź ghetto, and just on children's art. I have all Doris's artwork as a child, because anybody could have wrote, she drew pictures of, here, she drew this little picture. All right, I don't know if you can see it, but just of a farm. On the back of it's the Chinese paper she had to write it on. So, but anybody could have made of flowers and barns. So you ask a student, who drew this picture? Oh, someone in Indiana, Ohio, Korea, Europe. No, it was drawn by a girl in Shanghai. But the point is, this documentary allows us to fragment, to break out the Holocaust and to break down humanity in smaller chunks. So they absorb it in a smaller piece, and then they can discuss it. So I think the documentary, we can use it. I think we will use it.
Excellent. Well, in the past hour, we have covered a lot of ground. We've spoken about the history of Shanghai. We've spoken about the preservation of this history, the commemoration of this history, as well as the extent to which it resonates with today's world, and also how the three of you interact with this history. So I thank you. I thank you, Doris. I thank you, Danny. I thank you, Andy, for giving your time and your insights into this very important theme, this important history. And I hope that Harbor from the Holocaust is watched widely. Thank you very much.
Andy, it was so nice meeting you. I hope to meet you in person. You already know we're going to have breakfast again.
Thank you, Doris. Thank you, Kevin, Danny.
Yeah, Andy, you're a good speaker. No, you had a good message. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.